Thanks, Michael. It's a really an honor to be here, and so thanks for the invitation. Katherine, thanks for having me. I'm here to talk a little bit about my book, which just came out. When I was writing the book, the process was a painful one, frankly, and as I was doing it, I made a promise to myself that I was not going to do any book events. And I've said no when they've come along, except for when Michael emailed me to come here and speak about the book. I said yes, just because I think there's sort of any excuse to get past the security and get into the Cooper Union, especially see the architecture program, which I've never actually been in the building before. So this is a kind of one-off. It really is probably the only time that I'll talk specifically about the book. And there's a kind of symmetry in me doing it here because this place, even though I didn't go here, has always been a kind of special one for me as someone who's invested in teaching and pedagogy and architecture. So this is the cover of the book, a kind of set of meandering arrows, and I think the cover makes sense to the extent that the book can make sense, I think, only through a kind of explanation of exactly what I was thinking as I wrote it. So I'm going to spend about 20 minutes talking about the book and going through it, and then I will talk a little bit about how I think it might influence or my practice with my partner Anna Niemark in First Office, and also vice versa, which is to say how it influences the book, but also probably more importantly how my collaboration with Anna has been influenced or has influenced the book itself. The book, generally speaking, is about the questions of attention in the world, but specifically how my own thoughts about attention might be directed to architecture. The easiest way to kind of introduce it is just to read this, which is the preface. I'm going to read a couple of things because this is a talk about the book, so bear with me. When I was younger, people often explained my meandering descriptions of the world by saying I had attention deficit disorder. It's unclear if a professional ever diagnosed me with ADD. Different parents said different things. But the ambiguity surrounding my diagnosis sparked in me a lifelong interest in the subject of attention. Why should I pay attention, I asked. What is attention? Why is it so important? As a kid, I was being cheeky, but slowly as those around me struggled to define attention in a way I found satisfactory, I started to develop my own ideas about what kinds of things deserve attention and what kinds of attention those things deserved. Once I started teaching architecture and talking with colleagues and students, I began to articulate these differences, and silently at first, to question why only certain kinds of things and certain kinds of attention were rewarded when reviewing architectural work. It took years of conversations with many of the people mentioned in the acknowledgments before I could assemble enough ideas to fill a book on the subject. Now I have 4 chapters of text on 4 kinds of attention and more than 100 images to illustrate what the kinds of things that provoke them might look like. But even now, I still don't have a good definition for attention itself. Of course, I've read and unpacked various textbook definitions of the word, both on the internet and in most of the dictionaries in the UC Berkeley library system. They're all super interesting, so precise and focused. Nothing like the ongoing haze I experience whenever I force myself to, quote, pay attention. Maybe some will see this as an admission of failure, dismiss my ideas, and claim that this book and my interest in attention has been a gigantic waste of time. But I don't see it that way. Historian of science Lorraine Daston, whose work addresses both attention and interest, writes, "Attention sorts out the world. To attend is to distinguish the urgent from the humdrum, signal from noise, foreground from background. Without attention, our senses would be useless. We would look without seeing, hear without listening, touch without feeling. All experience would be as bland as pablum, without accent or interest." By distinguishing the urgent, the signal, and the foreground, by expecting our senses to see, to listen, and feel, Daston slips into an easy association between attention and interest. Like other descriptions of attention, I find this one frustrating in its pithiness, and the fast focused path it draws between the first word and the last, and the efficiency and clarity with which it juxtaposes and then isolates its terms, and the confident way it dismisses the terms it judges as negative. Perhaps my problem defining attention is just a lack of interest in the brevity and focus that interest seems to demand. In other words, attention's connection to interest brings with it the expectation of clarity and immediacy. But what if we were careful to uncouple attention from interest? Would this remove the expectation that attention requires us to sort, distinguish, and discriminate between things? Might we get rid of the negative connotations of things that are not interesting? What if we deliberately tried to look without seeing, listen without hearing, touch without feeling? What if we forced ourselves to turn from the interests of the urgent, the signal, and the foreground, and deliberately attend to the boredom of humdrum, confusion of noise, the comfort of background? It's worth a shot. The highlights are mine for the lecture. They're not actually highlighted in the book, but they provide the kind of larger structure. And so the sort of subtitle of criticism with no logical conclusions is then followed by a table of contents, attention being the preface, which I just read, and then 4 chapters that basically lay out the sort of general arguments of the book. The first one is on interesting and the way in which I think it is connected specifically to architectural criticism, which is to say that the specific and precise ways in which we marshal audiences in architecture to kind of focus in on one category of things. Boring is then the second chapter, confusing, and then comfort is the last in an index of references. The first chapter, interesting, sort of lays out interesting and tries to make a kind of a fairly precise connection between interest and criticism. The connection isn't mine, actually. There's a woman named Cyan Nye, who's an English professor at Stanford who writes about aesthetics, and she has written extensively on the history of interest and interesting, and is the person who specifically connects interest to the problems of criticism and the way in which they work as a kind of tactics with language to sort of isolate out certain things in the interest of focusing on others. And so it basically lays out this argument, and in some cases sort of regurgitates hers, and then connects it to the specific ways in which her more general argument is connected to architecture. And then it also lays out, let's say, specific ways in which interest works, both as a kind of weak category of something, which is to say interest is usually a kind of precursor to other stronger ways in which we react to things. So interest is a sort of spontaneous reaction towards something, and then because we could be interested in something for sort of good reasons and bad reasons. Every time we sort of take interest in a car accident, for example, it's not that our interest in it is necessarily a good thing. We can be just as interested in bad things. And so it tries to mine these specific aspects of interest and connect them to these other terms. And the other terms are, as I mentioned, comforting, boring, and confusing. And the book starts with this, a kind of basic semiotic square, laying out interest in a kind of in a sort of 4-quadrant system as being the quadrant that is both discernible and different, which is to say things tend to interest us that we are different, which is to say they stand out in a crowd, and they're discernible, which means that we know with some work that we can come to understand them. So it might not be that we can understand them initially, but that we believe that we can. The opposite of this would be boring. And so boring things are familiar, which is they say they're the same, but they're ambiguous. And so we can't come to understand them, or they just exhaust any attempt to. So the opposite of interest being both sort of ambiguous and similar. And then in the opposing quadrant, confusion is both an ambiguous and different thing. So things that confuse us are things that stand out, but they aren't things that we can sort of get our minds around or that we know that we can come to understand. And so this is why, for instance, I'm not interested in advanced calculus. I can't actually understand its concepts, and so I tend to be confused by it, and so I sort of resist attention towards it. And then opposite of that is both a highly discernible, but then same thing as where we find comfort. And initially, when I was making the book, comfort was normal, but I found that problematic for a series of reasons, and I think comfort is specifically an interesting word to talk about with respect to architecture, precisely because we tend to avoid using it when we're describing what it is that we're doing, as if it's a bad thing. Throughout the book, there are a series of images and other drawings that are related to some of these categories. I've called them post-construction documents simply because that's the sort of practices term for the umbrella term for the drawings that we make after the buildings have been done. My post-construction documents are a little bit different than most. Most of them are renderings. This is a Peter Markley building. And the images run in sort of parallel to the book. They're never called out specifically or placed in relationship to specific categories. They're more to set a sort of general mood and kind of look of the book that I think you might associate with some of the terms, but they're never actually pointed out as being boring, confusing, or comforting, or even interesting, precisely because I think of the terms as being productive only when they're sort of weak enough to kind of rub up against each other, and I want the images to sort of be somewhere in a kind of cloudy middle, a kind of forced ambiguity in the images as well. So Giatti building, some of them might become familiar, and then the buildings themselves obviously I think are important, but also the way in which they're rendered it becomes important with the way in which colors are used. And so, as Michael said, we are interested in color. In my practice, we're interested in a kind of a sort of low saturation way in which we can produce images where things begin to get a little bit fuzzy. And these are just to give you a sense of some of the other drawings. A building which is a collaboration between Victor Lundy's U.S. Tax Court, and then Peter Zellner and Ellsworth Kelly's Matthew Marks Gallery. Most of them are probably obvious in terms of the way in which, the ones that I've selected. And then in addition to that, there's an index which actually lays out the architectural drawings. And so all of these were done by myself without image rights and basically cobbled from the internet itself. And so the sort of proliferation of images in architecture and the kind of low-res, fast-moving JPEG begin to be the thing that's sort of copied or somehow traced to produce these images. And these are just some of the others. About half the images of the book are buildings that maybe many of you recognize, and then other ones are just things that I've encountered at different points in my life, or that different people have sent me as I was putting together the book. This is a ramp for a parking garage in Watertown, Massachusetts, near where I went to graduate school. A gas station designed by my father. A building in Berkeley, California. These are included because there is a highly subjective component to the book. It's in some cases meant to sort of blur the distinctions between objectivity and subjectivity, and so in some ways the book is a kind of architectural autobiography. And then other things like this, icebergs, Mount Everest, dolmens, which I'll talk extensively about later, and then buildings that look like dolmens. This being William and Chen's Seaside Pavilion, which I believe has now been torn down. I also try to connect these things at different points, the terms themselves, to a set of formal categories related to what interesting architecture might be, what boring architecture might be, what comforting architecture might be, what confusing architecture might be. But these are only contingent to the extent to which I think they help frame the other parts of the book. And so just to give you a kind of a flavor for what this was, I'll just read the interesting one and so you can understand what I mean. So interesting architecture establishes discernible part-to-whole relationships through the composition of new and differentiated parts. The areas of attention are typically clear, and the methods we use to discern and describe them are known or knowable. In its total composition, the whole appears different from other similar arrangements, and while there may be some degree of novelty, its origins or process or, quote, logic is traceable. Interesting architecture never appears arbitrary and is often described as rigorous. This is the type of work that lends itself to close reading. And I'll talk a little bit about that later in the lecture. And then boring, comforting, and confusing architecture that tend to exist in other forms of kind of deliberate ambiguity that stand in opposition to interest. Why I wrote this book, and then I'll quickly go through the chapters. I will admit it's a completely absurd premise at a certain level, and even to say not interesting is specifically to put attention on the thing in which you're interested in. But I will, and it's sort of easily dismissed as kind of ironic, which is what a lot of people have sometimes tried to sort of pigeonhole me as. And I would resist that and say that that kind of labeling sort of plays specifically into some of the traps that I think interesting architecture tends to, or those that would focus on interesting architecture tend to sort of marginalize or even discriminate against those that would sort of try to turn your attention to other places. And so there's a specific attempt in the book to sort of enlarge the kind of what I would describe as the social capacity of architecture. That's not to say it's trying to address a specific social problem through a project. I think that both sort of minimalizes the scale of the world's problems, and also I think limits the scope of what the sort of power of architecture to do many things. I mean specifically just the sort of terms and the different ways in which we talk about architecture and the different things we might talk about when we talk about architecture. And so that's basically the sort of the aim of the book. So I'll quickly go through the chapters. Each of the chapters sort of starts with an image, a kind of historical reference, then unpacks it, one of my own projects. So in the boring chapter, Denise Scott Brown, it starts with a quote about Los Angeles, which is where I'm from, and I think this is a particularly interesting quote, and then attaches it to the photographs of Ed Ruscha and then Katherine Opie, who's a contemporary photographer working in LA now. And Denise Scott Brown's quote is, about Los Angeles. It's the same even open-ended system with multiple possibilities for the definition and redefinition of focus depending on where you're at. Sometimes the yellows shine the brightest, sometimes the blues. And so that kind of even open-endedness is, I would say, a sort of quality of boring things, and then here's a series of lists of other things. In this case, this is my own rendering in the book of a building that was photographed by Ed Ruscha in some Los Angeles apartments, so some of the content is also directly implicates some of the image references. And then it sort of settles on Katherine Opie's Freeway series, which is a series of photographs that she did in the 90s, basically like this. These photographs were quite small, and they were displayed like this in a gallery, which is to say not in a kind of linear arrangement, but they kind of span the gallery and sometimes would break into sort of grids or columns. And they were sort of intentionally fudgy, almost sort of nostalgic looking, almost like a kind of blurry image you would see in a rear view window. And so in certain ways they weren't necessarily progressive or nostalgic. They existed in a kind of fuzzy, a sort of, I would say, a kind of fuzzy style, but also fuzzy in their reference and sort of whether they were looking forward or looking backwards, like actually quite literally. And then she titles all of her series of photographs, Untitled 1, Untitled 2, Untitled 3, but didn't arrange them in the gallery that way. And then also showed those with other series of photographs. So there'd be like 4 Untitled 3s in this thing. So there's automatically a kind of network of other things outside of just the photographs themselves. That kind of open-endedness, or the sort of desire to sort of intentionally blur things, was a precedent for the first project that I talk about in the book, which was a gallery installation I did at SCI-Arc in 2013. And you can see a full image of basically the gallery here, a series of kind of what I call pedestals, but basically kind of blank white discs on a white carpet. And boring in the way in which it might work, I tell the story of the installation photographer. So once I installed the work and had the gallery opening, and there's sort of a series of kind of, well, a lot of sort of like blank expressions, frankly, and sort of uncomfortable exchanges while people tried to congratulate me on specific parts of the project. But perhaps most interestingly, that was my conversations with the installation photographer. So SCI-Arc hires Joshua White to photograph this gallery, and he's probably photographed the gallery 25 times at least. And I had no say in what he actually photographed. And he went in and he sort of takes his establishing shot, and you can see this when he sent me the sort of low-res JPEGs of him. You can kind of scroll through and see his lineage of thinking. First, he takes a series of establishing shots and then starts to photograph these things, trying to find differences in them, even though they're all exactly the same, from different angles, sort of clustering shots. And then he starts taking photographs of things like this, which is just a blank wall with 3 outlets on it, noticing that some of the outlets look newer than others, and that I clearly placed some of them there. And then he started taking photographs of something like this. Now, I did not put a fake video camera in the gallery, but as the installation photographer, his job is sort of document what's actually in the show. He is sort of questioning the things that are actually part of the show and in the exhibit, in an architecture exhibit, because an architect could place things like this in a gallery. It's clearly not art. But he documented a series of things that weren't initially part of the show, but eventually became part of its documentation. And that's only through his sort of the contractual limits of his, well, let's say his contract, which was to take 50 photographs. And so when you're forced with basically an empty room, how do you satisfy that? And he just ends up in a kind of weird meander, questioning whether certain things count or certain things don't. Also, in each of the chapters, there's a series of notes at the end, and these aren't like conclusions, but they are sort of ideas, and each chapter adopts a different structure for the notes that is similar to the sort of theme of the chapter. So the boring notes, taking cues from Katherine Opie's photographs, sort of lay themselves out, sort of meandering from a kind of single list into sort of fat lists into sort of 2 and 3, and then at certain points they sort of fall out of order or they run through each other. So boring is associated with nothing, but too much of anything gets boring, where nothing actually also participates in a list, and the W of width also is a sort of numbering a list. These things all begin to kind of blur together. And then the number 38, for personal reasons, is repeated 3 times. I would also say, I just couldn't. The publisher sent me this because this is supposed to be 007, and I just couldn't put 007 in the book, so I just changed it to 07. And then there's obviously the opportunity for readers of the book to fill in their own the sort of limits of boredom. I'll also just sort of flick through some of the images. This is Andrew Zago's Korean church. Again, these images aren't necessarily meant to be associated with any of the particular categories. They can, at different moments, be organized in different ways. And for this lecture, I organized this particular chunk of them as a kind of series of architectural heroes. So Zago, Lena Bobardi, the Sale House by Johnson Markley, Moss is one of Moss's house, which I think is included for obvious reasons. And then the third chapter on confusing uses the Cornell box as its kind of point of origin. The Cornell box was a rendering test produced in the early 80s at Cornell to test radiosity. And maybe this is a little bit of what Michael's talking about. When I was asked to teach a representation course, for some reason understanding the specific algorithms of rendering became a kind of moment of a sort of point of fascination for me. And the Cornell box sets up a kind of classic art historical method of sort of compare and contrast, but it presents you with two almost identical images and forces you to look much closer at two things that look alike but are actually in fact produced in very, very different ways. One of them through photography, and then the other one through a rendering algorithm called radiosity, which is basically the algorithm that blurs light together. So it's intentionally meant to produce sort of fuzzy things. And so things like V-Ray rely a lot on radiosity, whereas ray tracing is the kind of high gloss specular reflections that are very interesting. Radiosity produces a kind of dull glow. And then I use this to sort of set up a chapter which adopts the sort of margin notes, which begin to kind of extend into the chapter itself. And so much like the Cornell box, where you're presented with two things that at least initially look alike, but are actually constructed in a different way, confusing the chapter presents two texts that are basically presented side by side, one in a kind of order of 3 columns and one in 2, and that's the only way in which you know that they're running sort of in parallel to each other. And so as you move through the chapter, the sort of 2 is one text, and then the ones that are divided up into thirds are another, but in certain cases they kind of blend between each other. And then it unpacks medium and the kind of productive ways in which a kind of medium confusion would work, confusing identities would work. And then presents a building or a project that we did in the Max Center where we were asked to produce a painting in an art gallery as architects would, so there's a kind of disciplinary confusion, and the story of that I also play out. Just briefly about this project, we were asked to do a painting in a gallery that also required us to use white paint, and so the way in which we decided to produce the image, which was of a mountain, we just went to all the paint stores in Los Angeles and asked them for their base white paint. So Sherwin-Williams base white, Behr base white, Home Depot base white, Lowe's base white, and then paint swatches together. And then there's obviously the image, the paint, the colors themselves are quite a bit distinct from each other, and so a sort of a kind of fuzzy image begins to emerge. And then just the question of how one produces a painting as an architect in the gallery, and things like spec sheets and the different sort of texts that architects typically write when it comes to producing architecture. And these are some of the images. The person who actually executed the painting is here, Ryan Work. She's sort of like slouching down. And then this just gives you a sense for how the notes are sort of play out. The numbers also sort of run like in there where they show up in the text, but not necessarily between texts. So 1, 2, and 3 doesn't work through each one of the individual texts, but just sort of its own geographic location inside the book. They sort of lay out that way. And then here's the clearest way you can see the two different texts, sort of 2 to 3. And then here's some of the images. The Blur Building by Diller Scofidio. Soil's Gallery in Korea. And a series of different buildings. So the last chapter is comfort. And in this chapter, a painting by Titian, as explained by J.M.W. Turner, lays out a sort of framework for how we might think of comfort, specifically in the way in which architecture tends to sort of sit in the background of things. And so in this painting, the sort of high contrast figures of both the landscape and the human figures, and supported by a much sort of lower saturation series of sort of browns and blacks that tend to be the architecture. And so this is a kind of model for architecture, is the way in which I begin to unpack the issues of comfort in architecture, and then use a series of models that we built for the Oslo Architecture Triennale a few years ago, where the models are basically the sort of elevations of these blank buildings that sort of propped up against each other. And so this is those models there, and here's a couple of different images. What we were particularly interested in with these buildings is the different ways in which they sort of brick in and then sort of cover up with paint the sort of suppression of formal articulation in these buildings, and then using paints to create kind of large graphics that tend to negate these things. but also comfort as a kind of relief, which is to say these things, we might find a kind of relief in these things, both as a kind of bas relief, but also just as our sort of relief from the kind of oversaturation of sort of, let's say, most buildings in a city. And so these things sit almost comfortably in the background and provide a kind of relief for us as we walk by them. The sort of sloppy details, again, are sort of deliberately so, and they're also highly calibrated, and they're actually individually fabricated. So in these models, the sort of wedges that hold the panels together are actually custom fabricated. And so this isn't to suggest a sort of bad detail that is sort of lazy in its execution. There's a kind of deliberate attempt to make these things poorly with a kind of high tolerance architecture. And so if and shims and other things like that are sort of aestheticized to sort of produce something where we make ourselves more conscious of things like tolerance in some of these projects. And then the notes for this chapter are laid out in the form of a kind of informal outline, and really just a series of sort of quotes that I think almost in a kind of stream of consciousness just sort of work themselves through, with sort of different people from both the discipline architecture and art, and then other quotes from sort of books that I think are related to all of the terms that surround architecture. Empathy, so Jason Payne's disco balls. For some reason, I just categorized them in this lecture as the sort of mirrored things initially. And Building by Petra Gibb. Churches of Lalibela, and then also a series of sort of natural objects, the moon, the sun, and then other things that kind of look like the moon and the sun. Round stuff. And then there is a kind of intentional decision not to produce a conclusion, but the interesting thing about comfort is that it is the thing, as defined by others, as a kind of category of things that deliberately makes ambiguous sort of subjects and objects. So comforting is the sort of interface between a kind of person and a thing to the extent that we can't feel it. So it really is an absence of something. And then it tries to attach that absence to a certain kind of anesthetics, which is to say it's sort of not visible and also sort of we can't really feel it, which I think is important as a kind of produces a certain symmetry or closure in some of the things I laid out in the attention preface, where there's a sort of what happens if we sort of look without seeing, touch without feeling. And I think comfort is a kind of weird category of things, and the ways in which our lack of terminology to actually describe it is probably because it is something that we can't necessarily feel. A book is, at least for me, is a kind of way to make explicit certain casual references that we don't oftentimes get to do as architects. And so the different ways in which in a book you can acknowledge people, both through, let's say, things like acknowledgments. Brian is here. She helped me a lot of editing and was a sort of probably understands the book more than I do. Michael Young obviously is one of the few friends I shared the book with. And so being able to lay this out is a kind of, it's a kind of nice relief in a way from the way in which architecture tends to be sort of put out into the world. To actually lay clear who your references are and the different ways in which you can do it in a book, I think was something that was quite nice to do, just in terms of things like the copyright page, obviously quotes and buildings by people you admire, but also things like choosing the font that was used in the first edition to Learning from Las Vegas. So there are more sort of subtle ways in which you can reference things, I think is quite nice. So this is the final sort of messed up semiotic square, and I use this as a kind of transition image because after having sat through 28 minutes of me talking about a book that's specifically about boring you, I guess there's a kind of open question about how some of these things might influence a design practice. And I guess what I'd like to do is talk about a series of projects that I've been working on with Anna, my partner, related to these things, really as a way to talk about how the book and our work both influence each other. And so I'm not going to explicitly use terms. I'm not going to talk about how these things are boring, comforting, or interesting, although I might use some of those terms. I'll probably, like we all do, habitually use the word interesting a lot, even though I'm trying to avoid using that word. But I show that just as a way to, I show these just as a way to show how we work and how this way of thinking, we try to force this way of thinking into some of the things that we do. So dolmens are something that Anna found a few years ago, and just to sort of describe what a dolmen is essentially a stack of rocks, and they exist all over the world. So one of the things that are sort of amazing about them is the extent to which every civilization or a lot of them through history all over the world, had the kind of primitive desire to stack big things on top of other big things. And there are, because of this, lots of different types of ways in which people stack stones, dolmens being only one of them. So Stonehenge, for instance, is not a dolmen. Although the categorization of stone stacking is, like a lot of the things we talked about, a little bit fuzzy and loose. But generally speaking, a dolmen has smaller capstone, or smaller legs, and then a larger capstone stacked on top of it. And so these are some sort of famous images of dolmens. They tend to be quite small, which is to say we don't actually know how to inhabit them in the ways in which we inhabit the things that sort of probably occupy us in the contemporary world or in our lives. They're a little bit too small to be buildings and a little bit too big to be furniture. People speculate that they're tombs because they find bones in them, but they can't date the bones to the construction of the temples. So they are quite blank, which is to say we have to invent reasons for them, and so they exist as things that we sort of project our own desires on. And so you can see a lot of these photographs just have kind of people kind of uncomfortably standing next to them, operating as both scale figures, but also as a kind of performance of awkwardness. And this intentional awkwardness is obviously something that we find to be quite interesting in them. Also because of this, well, let's say dolmens, they exist all over the world, and they also show up in representations through various disciplines, but surprisingly not things like architecture. So there are architects that have studied them, but for the most part, you see artist renditions of them, and so in this case, an artist basically greatly exaggerating a dolmen so that they can begin to occupy it as one would occupy architecture. Robert Smithson posing for what looks like an album photograph there's a kind of cool, relaxed posture both to the dolmen itself and then also his casual lean against it. Caspar Daedric Friedrich, another artist who obviously taken inspiration from them. Archaeologists have studied them and drawn them. There are various drawings and different ways of drawing them, much like a kind of developed surface drawing. Different ways to sort of protect and preserve them, produce things like this, sort of buildings around or sort of structures around dolmens so people don't knock them over, because sometimes they do get knocked over. But because there is no specific drawing, there's nothing that precedes it in the architectural sense, a dolmen, to put them back together is a kind of impromptu, almost ad hoc exercise in sort of rearranging stones that initially were just in kind of any way they could sort of prop these things up. And so there isn't a set of construction documents for them. And there obviously are people who have made models of dolmens. So this idea of models and dolmens in the ways in which we've tried to kind of force its intersection into architecture in our own work has tried to make comparisons between something like this. So Maison Domino, which was famously analyzed by Peter Eisenman and others, versus a kind of informal analysis of a dolmen. So whereas the Maison Domino, because it was produced through architecture, is sort of set up and preconditioned to accept the sort of formal analysis tools of architecture, so we can begin to unpack it and analyze it in different ways, whereas dolmens don't so easily fit into a kind of disciplinarily specific way of rendering them, of drawing them, etc. And so when you try to produce, let's say, a series of drawings that begin to describe a process of constructing them, you ultimately will fail, and you end up with just a kind of even, much more open-ended set of drawings of just different dolmens that you can categorize in very simple ways, like ones that have 3 legs and ones that have 2. And so just in making these drawings and sort of trying to make the comparisons, we slowly have begun to try to push these into our own work, first by just making models of them, and so beginning to kind of architecturalize them, these being a series of early study models of just the sort of abstractions of dolmens, and then ultimately a series of proposals for how one might take, scale, and sort of expand these abstract representations of dolmens into something like the MoMA PS1 competition. So 2 years ago we were finalists for MoMA PS1, and our proposal was a dolmen. This is it. We sort of everyone knows this courtyard, and so our dolmen tries to let's say casually align with this existence, but in certain places displays this kind of ambivalence. So it spans over a wall. It doesn't line itself up with the concrete wall that's adjacent to it. We couldn't sort of quarry and sort of transport large rocks, so that our dolmen is built out of wood. Well, this is a kind of speculation with a group of friends who are also here on how we might build this thing. And it also leans, much like a dolmen. It leans for water reasons, so it has to drain. But the drain sort of slowly drains to one side, but it's not sealed in any way, so as it drains it also leaks, much like a dolmen probably would. When it came to rendering it and borrowing techniques of rendering from architecture, the different ways in which we would produce rustication and the renderings started with basically dots. And those dots being a sort of 1 million nails, so this thing is a kind of overly fastened almost sort of decaying thing. And so in this, the scale model, you can see here with a laser cutter the kind of erosion that happens towards the end. The color is achieved by 2 different glow-in-the-dark paints. There are there's sort of 2 main brands of glow-in-the-dark paint, and so the sort of wash is produced with 2 of them. So the idea would be that it would sort of accept energy during the day and then kind of produce a dull glow at night. And you can see here the sort of eroded or rusticated corners in the dolmen. These are images. The people are so excited. It's like you all, they lost their heads. But these, needless to say, the folks at MoMA PS1 we didn't win. Let's just say it that way. But the idea here was that we would, because they're dolmens and because they are, let's say, they can and have been represented across disciplines, we would invite people into the show by also putting the show out in the world through a series of different ways in which, well, we would hope that the project would kind of circulate, because I find MoMA PS1 to be a very intimidating place to visit myself, and I was being asked to build something there. But also museums, generally speaking, sometimes don't do such a good job in outreach. And so we wanted to produce an app that would sort of exist in the world and that people could sort of access via their iPhones and stuff like that. So you can't get this anymore on the phone, but it's archived on our website, foff.net. So I'm just going to give a quick demonstration. Hashtag Dolmen. This is not a, it's not CAD software. These things aren't meant to be sort of exported out or 3D printed. It's simply just meant, well, we'll get back to that in a second. First, so what this allows people to do is basically create their own dolmen. And so you can just basically a sort of simple stacking of things, and then when you're ready, you can start over again. And there's a kind of randomization in it, so not all the stones stand up, and you can increase the sizes of them. You can also just sort of rapid fire. You can try to build dolmens on dolmens. My friend Andrew Bacon is here, and he I think he's the person who's played this game the most, and he sent me 3 dolmens stacked on top of each other. That's a kind of mastery of the dolmen software. This idea for apps, just as a sort of aside, we've done for a series of other things. So this was the sort of blocks of blah blah, which were the storage and that kind of bad detail model. And so again, this was in Oslo. We actually weren't, it wasn't in the budget for us even to go to Oslo. So the idea that everybody could sort of access this thing was a question, but we wanted to make an app that would allow people to kind of experience the show. You can kind of look at the elevation, plain oblique. And then the other one, just because, why not? This is maybe the sort of fun part of the lecture, is this thing, City Render, which allowed us to, you can both paint or asphalt or stucco, a series of randomly instantiated things. So this was a project that I'm not going to talk about sort of exporting Los Angeles. So Los Angeles for us is basically stucco, paint, and asphalt. So this is a kind of abstraction of that. Now I have to open up my lecture again. And those all work. They don't work on Chrome for some reason, but they will work on other, on all of the browsers. Sorry. I think for some reason Unity decided to crash it. I have to have a couple more. The title of this slide, Not Interested in Cooper Union, is no reflection on the way in which I feel about this institution. I do hold it in high regard. Okay, back to where we were. So we did lose, and that's with a sense of almost relief. Building something that big would have been quite a struggle, but we did build some smaller ones and explored some of the similar ideas. This was something we did for a group show where we produced a kind of plywood dolmen, in this case using screws instead of nails to produce the kind of texture, and then also borrowing from some of our earlier work, we wanted to produce a kind of very low saturation brown to render this in, and no paint that we could buy, basically looking on a color spectrum, would produce the subtlety that we wanted. So this is a paint called Black Bean Soup, and we just bought it at 2 different Sherwin-Williams stores and then painted them together. And you can see, obviously, this is not a doctored image. I mean, it just produces, they both have the same finish, everything, and just the discrepancies in the mixing machine produces a kind of contrast that is kind of disturbing when you think about like the degree to which, or the care with which we spec things like paint colors. And then looking at the kind of impossible thinness of plywood and the kind of bad section drawings that it produces in making this. Here are some detail shots. It's almost built like a very nice basswood model, just in terms of the way in which the sort of care with which we join the pieces of plywood together, and then the screw head type. So it has 5 different drive types. Each one of them aligns to a different set of things. So there's a square drive type, Phillips, standard, star, forget the 5th one. But these are some of the drawings that we made of those, and you can't see them so well, but you can see kind of here the different screw heads. This is it installed. It was part of a larger group show that LADG made this sort of large pink blanket. I like to show these 2 images, one because I feel like this is the way in which most people experience our work, which is to say their backs are turned towards it, almost as a kind of backdrop for drinking beer or checking out this much more interesting thing. And then also from the back, the kind of thinness. And this was something that was an inspiration to us in the next project, which was a small studio for art in Virginia. So in this case, at a certain point, I mean, dolmens are a kind of source of fascination for us. But when we were asked to design very quickly a fairly modest structure in Virginia, it's just kind of the stuff we were working with. And so when asked to come up with a proposal, the instinct for us was just to take some of the other models we were working with and just sort of put them uncomfortably close to the building itself. And the clients went for it to a certain extent. And so this is a kind of progression as the building goes from a sort of series of a dolmen model into something that's, let's say, more recognizable as a building. These are just some renderings of the building itself. Here are the drawings. This is the plan. This is the part of the original building, but was in the scope of the project. So it's to sort of divide it up, turn it into storage, and then a kind of art and display making space. And then certain things that were in the other sort of more casual dolmens, or the earlier dolmens, started to show up as sort of specific elements in this thing. So instead of the sort of leaning capstone, this becomes a sloped roof. Things like flashing and other things are exposed as a kind of reveal that's too large, which I'll show in a second. The client likes to say a small forest was destroyed in the making of this project. It was seriously engineered because this cantilever, despite how shallow it is quite heavy, and so it had to be tied back, and so it actually got quite a bit sort of bulky. Here are some of the images of it under construction. You can see here the sort of lean of the roof and then the revealing parapet on the other side. Sort of a funny aspect of this project is when we showed up for a site visit, the expansion joints in the concrete, there's an extra line. So if you look in the plan, you can see the line is sort of intentionally off-center. These are the expansion joints. But when we went and showed up, there's an extra line. And when we went back and looked at the drawings, this thing which we thought said centered on existing barn door was somehow actually built as one of the expansion joints in the concrete. It appeals to us, and when it happened, I was quite upset, and I was like, this just makes a great story. And then here's some of the pictures of the finished thing. So the copper flashing and this sort of flashing reveals as wood siding transitions from vertical to horizontal. Things like this were just moments when talking with the contractor, when he told us that we had to have flashing there, we asked him if he could just expose it a little bit more than he typically would, and then drawing those details became interesting for us simply because we felt like those sort of gaps or things like that we had celebrated in earlier, more speculative projects would be a way for us to kind of insert them into something like this without compromising the integrity of the building, but somehow staying true to some of our kind of anesthetic ideals. and then sort of shot in a forest. And you can see here the sort of open parapet and the sort of party in the back. Look, the building. This is sort of two different kinds of landscapes. So this is what happened when the artist moved in. And this is sort of the sort of outside in the weeds. So sort of filled it up. It's kind of messier on the inside than it ever would have been on the outside. Okay, I'll finish with just talking about this. At a certain point, just in, let's say, the way in which we work, Dolmens as a kind of source of inspiration slowly in itself becomes sort of diluted, and the work that we're doing with it begins to take on other references. And I think this is one of the things that's important to me in the book, where there's a kind of expectation when we present or talk about architecture that we construct linear narratives to explain them. And oftentimes things sort of come at us from the side. And I think it's a more, for me, like let's say a more approachable and honest way to discuss architecture. And so with the Dolmen project, one of the things that's happened is different people have sent us different things that they think are a reference or that we have found. And so this things obviously like the plan of the Barcelona Pavilion, possibly obvious, Carl Andre drawing, and then things like Battleship and our interest in games are also sort of implicated in this. And so through this, the issue of Battleship and an interest in apps and sort of building things out of boxes, we were asked by Airbnb to design an app. They ultimately didn't go forward with the project, but the idea would be that we would sort of stack programmatic sort of infrastructural units into a grid at different sizes, and then this being the sort of abstraction and this being the sort of plan, and that would produce a certain kind of ADU that people might use. And so these are a series of early speculations which are both reference to Dolmen work, let's say, but are also beginning to look like other things. Here's some of the sections, and again, you can see sort of resonances between this and the earlier stuff, similar rendering. And then this was a foam core model that played out the different ways in which we thought the game might work. And so you sort of arrange these things in a grid, each one of them being a different infrastructural core, and then you stack a capstone on top. And that was the rendering. That, they didn't like it. Somebody else, actually, they selected another architect who maybe some of you will know they're going to build one. But we are moving forward with this idea with a small backyard house in Virginia. And this is the house. This is the University of Virginia, and this is a large, actually fairly historic home that was occupied by a famous mathematics professor. And the client wants to rent this out and then live in a more modest structure in the backyard. This is the largest sort of undeveloped property near the University of Virginia. And so he wants a kind of low-profile structure in the backyard. And in this case, we tried to produce a more refined plan with this idea that there are no walls necessarily, just a series of sort of infrastructural cores that are connected through doors. And so it's a fairly straightforward plan, sort of walking from the front to the back. And then each of these things functions as a different kind of use. The beds are Murphy beds, so they themselves are their own. They have their own kind of density, closets, bathrooms, etc. And the sections are kind of oddly Dolmen-like. This is a skylight. You can see the sort of tilted roof. Just lastly, we're trying to convince the client to make this out of stucco, which is a hard sell in Virginia, where like Jeffersonian red brick is basically just what they build stuff out of there, especially this close to. But stucco is its own kind of common material, and the different ways in which it's finished with different dashing and sort of application of things like pebbles and sanding also produces drastically different textures. And so the idea is that this thing would be sort of rendered in stucco, render being the English term for stucco. And so the renderings of this and the kind of bad texture mapping is also emblematic of the actual way in which it will be finished, literally rendered in stucco. And I'm going to Princeton tomorrow to talk about the low resolution exhibition, and this is actually the house that's in that exhibition. And that's it. Thanks for sitting through that. I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has them.
Curious what you would say about this. So, first of all, thank you for the lecture. It's always great. It's interesting how entertaining something that's trying to not be entertaining actually can be when it's done as well as you did it. I know that sounds like a backhanded compliment, but it's meant in all honesty. I'm going to describe something, and I wonder what you think about it. When I sometimes show your work to other architectural colleagues of mine, sometimes students, and usually the first response they have is, I don't know, what's here? I don't know what I'm looking at. What is this? And then when you start to point to certain things, like you start to say, all right, so you see the way in which this is rendered out to look like it's rusticated stone, those are dots. Those dots are actually nail heads. So that the rendering has a very particular relationship both at the level of what it's attempting to allude to in its materiality, that's not its materiality, but then also a kind of completely blunt literalness with what it's actually communicating as a notational element. What I always find to happen is that the more and more you point at different aspects, subtle things happening right beneath the surface in your work, the more and more interested people get in it. And I think that's also part of what you've done with your lectures. You're able to direct our attention to very specific things. And in that direction of attention, the project begins to reveal its argument and begins to reveal its ideas in a fascinating way. So part of why I'm bringing this up is I know it plays into your hand in terms of part of the issues of the book, but how do you feel about that? How do you feel about the fact that at initial glance or at initial approach, that which becomes interesting is going to actually be out of many people's field of attention? And are you okay with it? And is it just then for those few who have the time and or the piqued desire to understand what these other things may be?
I mean, yeah, I think largely that's the point. I would say that a lot of this work originates in a kind of model of exhibitions and installations, which is when I graduated from architecture school in 2007. 2008 happened, and to be a young architect in that environment was. But it's just the work that I would say. I don't want to speak generationally, but it's just the sort of world that I was cast into, both as I started to teach because I needed a job, and then that was just the place. Those were the sort of sites of the work that I was doing, and so it gives you. There's an expectation when one enters into a gallery that there would be something of interest in that gallery and something in value, and so just playing into that as the context with which the work already operated inside of. So without that, it wouldn't be. I would say it's like the SciArc gallery exhibition. People expected a certain kind of exuberance in that space, and when presented with nothing, they worked very hard to fill it in, both out of just sort of their own expectations and then also as a sort of generosity towards me. And two things happened. One, like, yes, I could point out different things that happened to them and it would make them aware of those things, but what's far more interesting to me was that other things that people pointed out thinking that I knew about that and had no idea that had been done. Like sort of weird things about sort of colored fleck paints in the ground, positioning of certain outlets, obviously. Other things that people were tuned to based on their expectations, and conversations about those things were far more valuable and fascinating to me. And so I think a lot of the earlier stuff that I was doing relied on the context of an institution to do that kind of work. Now, working in or trying to work sort of by doing buildings and actually having a real and sincere interest in practicing architecture, the way to for me, frankly, to stay interested is to turn my attention to those other things that are just part of the kind of everyday aspects of running a practice. So things like spec sheets, notes, construction documents, and my own ability to turn those things into a conceptual project, just because that's the way in which I think, has become a big part of what we do. And so to talk about paint is simply just to point out the fact that spec sheets can actually be extremely interesting, and to read them is a certain kind of attention that you have to sort of switch on in your brain, precisely because that's just what you end up doing. And zoning code, all these things are just, and trying to get myself interested in them and then educate people that work with us and in our office, and we have a very small office, to find those things. Both, they are important, everybody recognizes that, but there's some value to actually studying what those things actually are. And then lastly, just the clients don't care about how you rotate the screw heads largely, and so the issues with flashing and stuff like that, those are sort of end up being, I think, a series of interesting conversations you can have with clients, so that you can point them out to a different kind of audience. And so there is this sort of game of both presenting that work here and talking about the sort of flashing reveal, and then convincing the client that there's some other value to it. And I just like the idea that things can operate in sort of separate realms and have value in more than one way. And so I think that's sort of the way in which I think about all of this sort of deliberately kind of fuzzy, pointing out different things, is ultimately they sort of work in parallel worlds, and they have different kinds of value to different people. And I think that's just sort of forcing people to that has been the sort of where we're thinking about that now. But really, all this stuff required sort of institutions and expectations inside those institutions as a point of origin. And we've had to figure out other ways to work it in as we've tried to develop a practice.
I have a question about dolmens.
Dolmens?
You spent some time over.
Yeah, we did.
So you compare I love those pictures of the dolmens and engravings, and they have a strong evocative quality. And now the question is, you compare the dolmens in your drawings there with the domino, Maison Domino, as seen by Peter Eisenman. I don't think we need Peter Eisenman, but we can see a Maison Domino for that one, because I think pure itself is better than as interpreted in 27 ways. Now, the question is that they couldn't be more opposite, right? Things. The dolmen, excepting having a support and a flat, relatively it's not flat. The materiality, the informality, the chance, all these things that make the dolmen a dolmen and not a domino house, which is rationally conceived, supposedly industrializedly built, etc., with no connection to the land. Those little things under there, and we know Le Corbusier hated the land anyway. So here you have something that's really deeply connected to the land. It's actually part of this land, these big rocks that somehow somebody found somewhere and concocted this three-dimensional structure. And so I can see your fascination with the dolmen. The question is that when you take the dolmen, this is a question, because I'm a little bit puzzled by this, which is that you present and you also talk about the difference, right? Then obviously you want to apply the dolmen as a formal system, right? And then the elements can be, and it's fun, you know what you do, but let's forget the funny part of it. Because I think you're being pretty serious under all these funny things. So the program can do funny things, and games do funny things, and Minecraft can do funny things, and all that, and things fall and pile up. So it's the only game I know, by the way. But the question is that what puzzles me is that you go back to means. After all these acrobatics of the dolmen, and they become completely rationally rigorous forms, no matter what forms you make their compositions, actually, in a very traditional way composition. Only they're Messians, right? And actually you end up with the Barcelona Pavilion, which of course I love, but I'm saying, so what's left of the dolmen? Now, is this an LA thing, that we represent things, and they're thin, and what you're left with is plywood representation of whatever with nothing behind, like in the stages. And by the way, I love LA, I go there a lot. But is that what it is? Is that a play on LA? And the dolmen, which is this very powerful archaeological object, actually, anthropological object. And actually it's interesting that Charles Moore talked about these things, right?
Yeah.
And the fire and all these things, very anthropological concept of place, and started with, I don't remember if it was dolmen or Stonehenge, but it doesn't matter, it was these things, these kind of structures. And then all of a sudden, you compare an opposition to the domino, and then you make your own little comparative little dolmeny things, and end up with meats. I'm saying, so who needs a dolmen? You know, if we go back to where you started opposing that, and you go back, I know that Mies and Le Corbusier were kind of considered opposites, but it's the same club, right?
Mm-hmm.
The same club. So, in particular, Domino and Barcelona. So, what do you say to that?
I mean, first about the LA thing.
Well, that was like an
But no, I
added
actually think there's something to it. I mean, there's a bank that Frank Gehry did in the early '80s in the Valley. At the time it was called the World Bank Center, and now I think it's like a Wells Fargo. And it has a kind of western front on one side of it, which is actually the back side of it. So in the parking lot, and what faces the street is a kind of perspectival section, literally like inscribed with the mullions and fenestration into the building. But the front, the sort of front, which is the back, has that kind of bad sort of thin plywood, sort of like the kind of veneer, that sort of LA thing.
In LA all over the place without Frank
Yeah,
Gehry? Where do you think Frank Gehry got it from?
Right, no, I think Frank, so this is just to say, like, this is a kind of example of a famous architect adopting certain things that are all over the place in Los Angeles. And so I acknowledge the kind of superficiality, at least as an aesthetic, in some of the projects, and it's something that's come up before, and I think is an astute observation, because I think it's true. With respect to the sort of trying to get from Korb to Mies through Dolmens,
Well, I'm sure
that is not
the Dolmen evaporated basically and went back to Mies. So.
Well, I mean, I kind of like to tell the story that basically, maybe the story I would tell in the future is that that it was intentional, that there is a kind of connection through Dolmens from Korb to Mies. But honestly, I think this is work that's developed over 3 or 4 years, longer than that actually now, and at a certain point that architectural references come back into it is kind of it's reassuring in a way, which is to say we didn't like you can work with these things that resist clarity and develop a whole series of tools through which you try to render them and kind of obfuscate and make ambiguous things that should be clear, and at a certain point they kind of resolve themselves back into something else that's quite clear after sort of 3 or 4 years
That's
of work.
The problem.
I mean, I just think it means that the project is over.
Said in the beginning, I mean, it's not my problem, but I'm saying I followed you.
Yeah.
You know, tried very carefully with a semiotic square and then the semiotic informal thing, whatever diagram. And you know, you talk a lot about fuzzy and ambiguities and all these things, and all of which you could find as looking at it from an architectural perspective in this Dolmen. So here's the connecting element to architecture, but there's this other quality, that's the evocative quality of this object in so many levels, the materiality, the chance, the time, the erosions, the whatever, you know, the animals hiding under a people or whatever it is, or peeled oranges in there. But the thing is that, in a way, all of that, which is the richness of this object that you focused on, and I think that's the great gesture, all of a sudden goes in going, as you put in oppositions to Domino, and then it ends up, it's like you sow doubt. In a way, you know what I'm saying? I'm not saying...
I definitely saw doubt.
I'm not saying this in...
I think the entire project in a certain way is about doubt.
I'm not
but
trying to see this in any insulting way.
I'm not taking it.
Like, you know, tongue-in-cheek. But in a way, it's like, you've got a beautiful thing, and then it goes back to that drawer. Nothing, it's a compliment.
I mean, I think doubt is... It's kind of where you reveal, like, it's exactly sort of what I'm trying to instill in all of these things in a way, which is to say there's no ideal, there's no sort of perfect model for anything, and all of that, and the way in which you reveal that is through a certain kind of skepticism and doubt that I have, and that, I would say anybody, even different people who have analyzed, like all the way back to Perot, like when he basically shows that the orders are essentially invented as a series of proportions and they're highly subjective. that only arises out of a certain kind of doubt about anything being ideal. And I don't know if the Dolmens did that to the domino. I mean, I think it's also a kind of clever wordplay, but there's a sort of phonetic similarity to them that we also like. But all of it is meant to sort of, at the very least, kind of register and sort of a bit of doubt in the sort of models that we hold up as ideal in architecture, and just see what happens when we destabilize them with weird things.
I'm going to try to elaborate a little bit from where Diana left off. Some of it is comments, some of it is questions, but there's a moment in the process where you drop the stones and they stack. I think there's an expert in one of these rows here in that you understand that you're interested in a kind of machinic process that is not so much interested in composition as it is in an operation. And I may have this wrong, but it captures somehow, you know, what happens in the roughness of the stone and in a kind of a compositional sense that you're never able to retrieve that Nicene moment or the Corbusian moment for that matter. And then when you start building them, that kind of order gets instilled in there. And so that's just a comment. Then one realizes that within your own sense of composition, you don't allow flushness. Actually, there are moments like this that push out, particularly when it's not only that you have a parapet with a roof behind it, but the parapet pops out and it forces the condition of a soffit, for instance, which produces that kind of thickness and depth where there's only thinness. But I also didn't see moments, and maybe I didn't see it, it's there, where you do the opposite, where a volume sticks out of that parapet, forcing the other, you know, potentially disastrous condition of the ledge.
Yeah.
And knowing that there seems to be many things that you're interested in, or at least many scales in which you're interested. One seems to be the kind of the raw composition, or the anti-composition. The other one is the detail, as you get deeply invested in the kind of configurative aspects of these things that are either done automatically by the building industry, or they're done by Nice because they're precisely what this detail and not that detail, and you seem to be investing in those. What do you do in that moment that advances somehow your conceptual project, knowing that that's where it's going to leak?
Oh, and right here.
Right. Yes. I guess that's. There's more than one point. Am I looking at a skylight right there? Or?
Yeah. This is the sort of idea for a skylight. It was no longer in the project.
That's not the.
It also doesn't work. But yeah, I mean, it leaks in a way in which we can't build it for the budget.
But is is that skylight an extrusion or is it? I mean, my thought was that you would allow it not to be a skylight. You would allow that there's many of them. It happens in many instances.
Yeah, they become gutters. It's the same thing. So we originally wanted to on that side. So when the parapet comes down on that one project and turns into a gutter, it's the only place. Like we actually wanted that wall to stick out and sit under that gutter. And this. I mean, I know I'm moving through these quite quickly.
But you're concealing. I mean, I want to actually see. So here the gutter is revealed.
Right.
But I don't see that ledge I'm asking for.
Right. We originally wanted a ledge there.
You wanted.
Yeah, so it would sit out, and then the gutter would sit on top of it.
And the gutter would be revealed, or would the wood go in front of it?
No, it would be revealed.
Why would it be revealed?
There's a couple of different reasons. One, it just appeals to us, and exactly what you just described. That there's a kind of there's no desire. There's no middle scale, which is to say, there's no desire to suppress those kinds of details. So in minimal, like at certain points, people have criticized us of being sort of minimalists, and it's exactly not what we're doing. Precisely because those things with reveals and the different ways in which the kind of common everyday materials are expressed are interesting to us. And so there is a sort of large scale move, and then a desire to begin to sort of aggregate the smaller scale stuff on top of it.
Yeah.
to move away from a discourse of minimalism.
Fair enough. Does the downspout fit into that same discourse or a separate discourse?
It does.
The downspout is part of that.
Yeah, it does, for sure. Because in minimalism, you would work to embed it, to hide it. That all those things you'd want them to go away. And I think
because the downspout could arguably be lodged into the ready-made, which is yet another discussion. Because these dolmens are not ready-mades at all, and they're not from Home Depot either. Even if the materials are bought from Home
Right.
Depot, the downspout is something else. And you had it in one of your analytical drawings where it went, down and through the canopy and then back down
Yeah.
again. It seems to come from a different discursive space.
Huh.
Where you don't see that.
I mean, I can see that it probably does. It's not the way in which we've described them. So it's the way in which we frame those kinds. I wouldn't say ready-made, but off the shelf is certainly something that we're interested in sort of directing attention to because those are precisely the sort of moments that we want people to have. What we don't, they're not meant to be theatrical. They're not meant to be these things that you can't sort of place and there's no scale to them. It doesn't try to reside in that conversation. And so the sort of off the shelf, I mean, these aren't off the shelf gutters. So, but in some of the other projects we have some of that stuff, but we want to show those things. I think they're precisely related to a kind of desire to deal with crude things that have high tolerances. You go to Home Depot and work with off the shelf projects, you're talking about a kind of 3-inch plus or minus and all of the tolerances that you're dealing with things like molding, gutters, and all this other stuff. And we want to be able to play in those spaces. I mean, I think that stuff is, I don't have the project here, but we did this project with a double Duchamp door. The original diagram for that is just basically 2 intersecting walls with doors that open and close seamlessly. Well, the second you start to get into the dimensions of lumber and then also just molding, which is you have to cover, you immediately produce a kind of hiccup in the plan. What starts off as a kind of pure cruciform thing.
It's actually like that.
Right, and then it's offset. It's offset enough that when you put it in a small house, on either side of the wall, you're gaining over a foot into each space. Well, the rooms are 10 feet by 10 feet. A foot either way takes something that wants to be evenly applied and gives it hierarchy. And those types of things where their architectural consequences that extend into the programming of something like a house, I think are valuable. And if we were not trying to be conscious of the sort of dimensions of off-the-shelf products, we never would have made that discovery. And so,
But isn't it like, I'm sorry to interrupt you, because you're getting into all these details which another ask you, but I keep on looking at this picture, and frankly, what I see is a big figural gesture.
mhm.
Then you find a way to make it happen, that big kind of wall-y thing against, hanging there,
Mhm.
I don't know if it's a typical American town front and then you see a pitchfork in the back or whatever it is, but it's a big figural gesture that you wanted there.
Mhm.
It's certainly not a dolmen because it's not supporting anything and it's a shear thing, so
No.
clearly it's not the operation.
Right.
And it's also not a ready-made
And it's not ready-made.
or a Home Depot.
So what is that big
Oh.
wally thing? I don't know what to call it. I call it wally thing. It's
This
just like a wall there because it can't be like just a frontispiece, right?
Uh-huh.
It's too tall for a frontispiece, too thick, not thick enough, So tell us about that piece. I'm curious.
I mean, my answer to the fact that it's not a dolmen is yes, it's not a dolmen, but there are certain lessons learned from them, and those things show up. And so there's the work that we do in our office and in our teaching, and then at a certain point, someone asks you to design something, and there are just the things that are on your desk and that are already in play. And so when we did this, we were also working on this. Right, a kind of thin reveal of something that looks massive from one side, but as you move around it, it becomes thin. And there was a sort of when we and this you can see from the front. There's something about that that we like, both in the way in which it received here, and then in the angle in which you would approach that.
Yeah.
So that is actually the Virginia project is a guest house that has this thing attached to it. The view from the kitchen of the main house looks at that broad face, which is washed that color. And in almost any sort of foliage condition, it almost completely goes away as one looks at it through a forest on the sort of blank side. And so it's almost totally, because what they wanted was an invisible box. And then, I mean, these are just things that what we were already working with played into what the clients were actually interested in. And so then, as we moved around it, we wanted to reveal that thinness precisely because of the effects that we had, well, the qualities that we liked about this one.
But in the house, you don't have this effect, right?
It
You
gets
don't
thin.
see the thinness.
This is pretty thin. I mean, it seems thin to me in comparison to,
Oh, when you see that detail.
yeah,
But not in volume like in the
Like
other
this.
case.
like
You
something that
see
looks
it
quite massive.
as close, let's say, right,
Yeah.
as a volume.
And this seems pretty, I mean, for me, I would argue this seems quite bulky, and then when you move around it, there's a sort of moment where you're aware of the thinness, and that was
Okay.
something that we were,
But it's a giant buildup to make it work. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not thin enough.
yeah. Well, it's thinner.
Are you interested in things?
I mean, I think for sure we were interested in the sort of optical effects of some of the sort of, when we were asked to make, when we wanted to make a dolmen in New York, or when we proposed to make one, and something about the sort of massiveness of that thing never being revealed in the way, if it had been built, seemed like a missed opportunity. And so when we made the other one, we could make it with less material, and we were precisely interested in something that appeared from one direction to be quite massive, and then the other did
I'm
not.
asking specifically from this house or
Yeah.
this edition. If given the opportunity, would you have preferred that parapet to be like that thin plywood edge of the other projects?
That was my precisely.
No, I prefer it as it is.
Because it's a mere reflection of the technologies of a 2x6
Yeah,
that
because
is there.
it's the dimensions of the thing in which it's constructed out of. I'm not. There's nothing.
I haven't managed to ask a good question yet, but I want to.
Elizabeth
I'll
has
ask
been
a
trying to.
question.
I want to start by what I went to a presentation of another architect this morning, very eloquent, as eloquent as yourself, and he said he was not interested in forms per se, but rather in solving society's problems and the questions that you have to discover in order to be able to effectively respond to those issues. And then as he flipped through the book that he was launching, I realized, my God, what a wonderful, amazing authorship. And that this guy is really good. But somehow, despite all of the different questions that were being posed by society, by all of the different scales at which he was being forced to operate, all he could do was dolmens. That's all he did. I have to end and then begin my day with dolmens.
You're showing dolmens too?
So I swear to God, I'm not kidding you. And so
It's the worst part of my day.
So, and you know, since he got the Pritzker, he's been able to do more work, so I've been able to see the work now built. So, and this is Aravena's work. And
Yeah.
somehow he manages to do monoliths and dolmens in some fashion or another. And there's a deep-seated way in which he's been able to evade all of the things that you are actually claiming are interesting, not innocent, about the ready-mades. And you haven't said the ready-mades. I'm the one who said that. But I guess I would ask you then the corollary question that he asked himself. What is the question then that drives your fancy? Or is it precisely in the quadrat that resides somewhere between the boredom and the interesting and the?
I mean, I think there's something at stake with questions of form, and I would just answer. I would sort of respond to just my response would be to this: the extent to which architecture can actually address problems outside of architecture, I would say, has to be through issues of form and aesthetics, and that's the world that I work in. I believe that that's the case. I just don't think that it can totally. I think it can participate, and it's. I would say it's assuring that people can make the claims that have similar references to the work that we do, and then they launch it at sort of larger issues. I am invested in the degree to which architecture can participate in sort of and be part of the conversation in sort of larger societal and even political, cultural questions. But I reject the idea that we can, with one project, actually address those issues directly. And so
I wasn't suggesting.
Yeah, no, I know you don't, but I would say that there is a sort of place for questions of form and aesthetics, and it can be attached to those things. I look for those types of connections, and that's what I think. I teach at Berkeley, and I had to. It's just a sort of matter of survival, honestly, there, and also in now one that I actually truly believe that those things can be linked, and we have to be very careful about the ways in which we do it, and that is what I think about when I think about architecture, and especially the way in which I talk to my students, because they are precisely interested in those issues.
I have a question that goes back much earlier in your lecture, although what you just said about things that matter and things that have consequence, and just speaking about things as if they do matter, maybe comes into it. And it was when you were showing your two-dimensional work, the images, and my question was, sometimes I think you refer to them as images and sometimes you refer to them as paintings.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering what they were. So were they paintings or were they renderings? Because you would refer to them as things that seemed boring as a rendering,
Mm-hmm.
like nothing's going on here, and yet they were quite beautiful as paintings.
I would call them out of habit renderings, but I think probably more honest would be to call them images, which is to say they exist somewhere in a kind of in this sort of blurry spectrum between photographs and renderings, and those two things, and the thing that I think is interesting about the Cornell box is it works to bring those two things together. So photorealistic rendering is a kind of funny term for me, precisely because we use photos to make renderings, and vice versa. Like they don't exist so cleanly in both worlds, and those images are meant to. A lot of them they start with photographs, and they try to recompose certain elements to produce images. And so, if I called them renderings, that was more out of habit. I would probably more correctly call them images, mm-hmm. and there's some kind of blurry space between photographs and renderings, and I am interested in sort of muddying those waters. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Do you collect anything?
No. Until recently, I wouldn't have had enough. Didn't live in a place that had enough room to collect anything, and so the only thing that is collecting is the stuff that I left in Boston when I left there 15 years ago in a self-storage unit. I've collected that. Yeah.
Is there a story behind the name of the practice?
First Office?
Yeah.
There is. My partner, Anna's, we couldn't figure out what to call ourselves, and we're sort of skeptical of the fact that we would call ourselves anything. And Anna was talking to her mother, and her mother was asking her what we were going to call ourselves, and she was like, well, I don't know, it's probably just going to be our first office. I don't really think it's going to be like the office. And she said, well, you should just call it that. That's a true story. And that was, it's probably the best thing. It's the reason why I think we stay together is because we were both attached to the name. We slowly started working separately, but no one wants to give up the website.
Except like the kids.
Firstoff.net. Just anyway, yeah.
I'm still trying to work out the semiotic quadrant that you had, and the interesting, boring, comforting, discomforting, right?
Comforting. It's confusing, boring.
Confusing.
Yeah. I can go back. Anyway. I can do both if you want to.
Okay, right. So there was the quadrant that had a certain amount of clarity, but then there also was the reconfigured diagram with all the swirly arrows. And so I'm trying to figure out if you are interested in fitting somewhere within this quadrant, or maybe your placement within this is ambiguous, or you're interested in the dissolution of the diagram itself. And so that's part A of my question. And part B is you also define what is interesting through an idea of close reading. And it seems to me that the undertone of the way you described it was a rejection towards close reading. Yeah. And yet your work becomes interesting through maybe not close reading, but at least close attention or sustained attention. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious what you think the difference is between those two, and then how that relates to either the structure diagram or unstructured or dissolved diagram.
I think attention is a much more expansive term, and close reading applies a certain kind of textual component to understanding the work. And so you have to sort of source out and trace through its lineages and sort of reconstruct the kind of logic to the thing to understand it. And close attention, I think, is much more sort of dispersed, just generally speaking. In terms of where I locate myself in this, I think there's a sort of dashed line around it. And I sort of think of myself as moving around in it. I am not interested in sort of what happens at the periphery. Interest eventually turns into something like excitement. I actually talk about this in the book. I'm interested in these things to the extent to which they sort of are closely aligned with each other, and they tend to be fairly weak. Interest leads to excitement, confusion just lead to sort of chaos and nonsense. Boredom, I say this in the book, it leads to death. That's a bit extreme. And comfort just leads to a certain kind of laziness that I'm not interested in. That there's a boundary around them, and that these things sort of rub up against each other, and somewhere around the center is what I think of as the most intense point. And I just try to operate in that sort of realm, where there's sort of things that circle around all of it. You can sense people getting a little bit anxious. Anyway, thanks for coming and asking questions.